Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's lunchtime lecture. The speaker today is Dr. Mairead MacSweeney. Mairead got her PhD in 1999 and then did a postdoc at UCL before going off to Oregon to work with Helen Neville for a couple of years. And she's a Wellcome Trust Fellow, actually now a senior fellow, working in the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, and is also a co-director of DECAL, the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Center here at UCL. So I've known Mairead for a long time, and we've collaborated on various projects over many years. And she'll be speaking today about language and the brain, insights from deafness and sign language. Right.
Thank you. So, I have a green light. I think that's a good sign. Okay, so I will be talking about language and the brain. And the main point that I want to get over to you today is that when we think about language, and we think about language from the perspective of people who are born severely or profoundly deaf, and those who use sign language, then it encourages us to take a much broader perspective of language processing. So up until about 15 years ago, language researchers took a very, what we might call, audiocentric view of language processing, focusing predominantly on auditory speech. But now it's much more accepted and acknowledged that we get a lot of information, useful, important information about language and communication through the eyes as well as the ears. So for hearing people, language is better thought of as multimodal. So even as hearing people, we are often very reliant on visual speech. So if you think about communicating with friends in a noisy pub, if you can see their faces, then it's a lot easier than if you can't see their faces. We also get a lot of information from gesture when we're talking to people. And we also access spoken language visually when it's written down in text, because that's what text is. It's a visual representation of spoken language. And then when we think about people who are born profoundly deaf, and that's the group that I'll be focusing on today, then we can consider the special case of sign language. So today, in the short time that we've got, I'm just going to focus on my research in two of these areas. So I will be, sorry, I've got two screens on the go here. It's not ideal. So I will be talking about sign language and how we can use sign languages as a tool, a scientific tool, to gain unique insights into language more generally. And then I'll also be talking about reading and thinking about how deaf children learn to read, because it may become, thank you. So, is that better? Yes. So it may come as a surprise to you, but deaf children find it difficult to learn to read, because when we read, we're reading spoken language written down. So I'm going to focus on these two areas of research. Okay, so sign language. What do we mean when we talk about sign language? Well, it may come as a surprise to you, as it does to many people, that sign languages are different in different countries. So there is not one universal sign language that's used around the world. In this country, we have British Sign Language, so BSL. In America, we have American Sign Language, and so on. And this fact is highlighted nicely on this Sheffield Forum website, where Emma said that she decided to try to teach herself sign language and bought a book from Amazon, but unfortunately she bought an American one. And then she asks the helpful community online, is there any point me learning anything at all from this book? And Nutty Girl isn't that nutty after all, and says ASL is totally different from BSL. She's quite right. But the internet can be a harsh place, and then she follows up with sell your book or go and live in America. So this fact that sign languages are different in different countries often upsets people almost. People are astounded. They say, how ridiculous. Shouldn't deaf people all get together and use the same language around the world? Well, surely hearing people should do the same thing. And we don't. And the reason that we don't do that is because languages aren't created in a classroom. Languages develop where there is a pressure for a community of people to communicate. And in the last 20 years or so, there's been a number of instances in developing countries where deaf children have been provided with education with schools for the very first time, and deaf children have been brought together for the first time, and linguists have been able to watch as they have started to communicate with each other, and a language has started to develop, and then watch as it has evolved from older children being passed down to younger children. Now, the next important point that we have to raise about sign languages is that they are distinct from the surrounding spoken language. So, many people think that sign languages are simply a collection of gestures that support the spoken language, but they're not. So just as spoken languages can have different word orders, so too does British Sign Language, and spoken English can have different word and sign orders. So I'm going to give you an example now. So in English we might say something like, the cat sat on the bed. And in BSL, the sign order would be bed, cat, sat, which would look like this. So the sign order, bed, cat, sat, is totally different to the English word order. So the fact then that we can analyze sentences and the structure of sentences in this way, at the syntactic level, supports this last point that sign languages are natural human languages that can be analysed by linguists at all of the same linguistic levels as spoken languages can. And all of this information, along with a wealth of relentless campaigning by the deaf community, led to the UK government to recognise British Sign Language in this country on the 18th of March 2003 as a language in its own right. So the aware amongst you will notice that tomorrow then is the 12th anniversary of recognition of BSL by the government in this country. Okay, so all of this is very interesting, but what does it actually tell us about? Does it link to the brain? What can it tell us about the brain? So once we've established that signed languages around the world are true languages, are real languages, just like spoken languages, then we can use sign language as a tool to help tell us more about language processing in general, and they allow a unique tool to address this question of which brain networks are involved in language processing. So, if we were only to think about how the brain processes language from the perspective of spoken language in hearing people, then it's really difficult to dissociate, so to pull apart the low-level auditory processing regions in the brain from what we're interested in, so the bits of the brain that are really doing the hard work of linguistic processing. Similarly, if we were only to think about sign language processing, it would be very difficult to pull apart the regions that are interested in visual processing from truly determining the regions that are doing the hard work of language processing. But by comparing the two, then we can gain a much richer insight. So if we can compare how signed and spoken languages are processed in the brain, then we can identify those regions that are involved in processing both sign and speech. And then we make the argument that whatever these regions are doing truly is something to do with language processing, and then we can go further into asking what are these regions actually doing. And where we see differences in here, so where we see differences between sign and spoken language processing, then we can attribute these to what we call modality, so how the languages are received, so whether it's received through sound or through vision. Okay, so in one of our very early studies, a very long time ago. This was in 2002, so this was even before the UK government had recognised BSL. We contrasted hearing people watching English and with deaf people watching BSL. So what we've done here was to have hearing speakers lying in a fMRI scanner, so in a brain scanner, and we showed them videos of a much younger looking me saying sentences. And so they heard me say the sentences and they saw me say the sentences. So this is what we call audio-visual speech. And we contrasted their activation in their brain when they saw this to when they just saw a static image of me on the screen. And what did we see? Well, we see greater activation in the left hemisphere than in the right hemisphere, and greater activation in two regions that we know that have been well established as being involved in spoken language processing. So Broca's area towards the front of the brain here in the frontal lobe, and then more towards the back up here, Wernicke's area at the junction of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. And these two regions we've known for a long time are core regions involved in spoken language processing. Okay, so what did we see then with the sign language? So, we also then showed deaf native signers videos of a signer saying, showing the BSL sentences, the translations of what was going on in the English videos. And deaf native signers mean that they have been born to deaf parents who sign, and they've grown up using British Sign Language as their native language. So these are the ideal people to test this question with. However, they are quite rare. There's only 5 to 10% of the deaf population actually fall within this category of being deaf native signers. So what did we see? So we see, again, greater activation in the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere, and these regions that are what we're going to call the core language regions, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, involved in sign language processing just as they are in spoken language processing. And this degree of overlap is seen better on this overlap map here, where we are overlaying activation that was common to both languages, to both British Sign Language and English. So this core left hemisphere network of Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and then extending regions. Okay, so another way, the data I've just shown you come from contrasting two groups. So that's hearing people listening to English contrasted with deaf people watching British Sign Language. Another way to address this is to look at how these languages are processed in the same brain. And the neatest way to do this is to look at this group who are hearing native signers. So these are the hearing siblings of those deaf native signers that I mentioned a minute ago. So they're hearing, but they're born to deaf parents, and they grow up learning, in this case, American Sign Language from their deaf parents. So this is a study from Karen Emery in the United States. So she showed these hearing native signers videos of people saying English sentences and American Sign Language sentences, and then this is the overlap between those two language inputs. So again, slightly more going on in the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere, and these two core regions, Broca's area, extending all the way up here, and Wernicke's area, more involved in processing both languages. All right, so we have seen then, I've given you a snapshot of some of our data, and there's lots of studies out there now from us and from many others, clearly showing that this core left hemisphere network is involved in language processing and across a range of different tasks, regardless of whether the language is being delivered through the eyes or the ears. Okay, what about the flip side of this then? What about the differences? So, going back to that study that I just showed you a moment ago, which was the hearing native signers watching both sign language and English, this image is showing you where the differences are when those two languages are contrasted. So, in blue, we have greater activation for English than American Sign Language, and the blue regions sit around here on your brain, and these regions are involve auditory cortex. So, not surprisingly, when hearing people are listening to speech, they're showing greater activation in auditory cortex than when they're watching sign language. And greater activation for sign language than English was found in these huge regions back here, at the back of the brain on both sides. And these regions are involved in processing vision and in particular in processing visual motion. So these two findings aren't that surprising. There's a lot more motion going on in the sign language than in the English. And of course, these are hearing people, so they're hearing the English and not hearing anything in the ASL, so their auditory cortex is activated for the English. So those low-level differences can be attributed to low-level processing differences in how the languages are received. But this study also showed differences higher up in the brain. So up here, there's greater activation for sign language than English, up here in parietal lobe on both sides. And the parietal lobe we know is particularly good at and particularly interested in processing space. And now there's a growing number of studies showing that the parietal lobe may play a particularly important role in sign language processing. So it's involved in spoken language processing, but it may play a more important role in sign language processing. And so I'm going to show you explain one of our studies that highlighted this a number of years ago. So we had deaf signers in the scanner, and we exposed them to BSL sentences that either used space to represent real spatial relationships, or that used space, but it wasn't talking about real spatial relationships in the world. So, what do I mean by this? So an example of a sentence with real spatial relationships would be our favorite from before, so something like the cat sat on the bed, which looks like this. So you have to pay very close attention here to where the hands are in space to know that the cat is on the bed, it's not under the bed or next to the bed. And then we contrasted this with other sentences where space is being used, but we're not really telling you where those things are in real space. So this would be a sentence like the brother is older than the sister, and I'll voice this as I sign it. So it looks like this. So it looks like this. Brother, sister, older. So we have the brother here and the sister here, and I'm telling you which one is older, but they're not telling you where they are in the real world. So when we contrasted these two that are using space, but they're using space differently, we found greater activation in these deaf signers in the left parietal lobe up here, as indicated on this slide, suggesting that these spatial sentences really are recruiting the special spatial processing skills of the left parietal lobe. Okay, so what have we learnt so far then? So in this whistle-stop tour then I've shown you that there are differences, some of them between how sign and speech are processed, some we can attribute to quite low-level differences between just sound and vision, others we can attribute to more interesting differences in the use of space. However, I think that the more interesting part of our findings and the findings in this field is the fact that we get this core language network in the left hemisphere that is involved in language processing regardless of modality, so regardless of whether the language is coming in through the ears or the eyes. And I think that the challenge for this research field in the future is to really drill down into what aspects of linguistic structure these different regions are interested in, how a language is represented in these regions, and what processes are actually going on in these core regions. Okay, so I said I would cover two of our areas. So I covered sign language and how we can use sign language as a tool in basic science research. So now I'm going to talk about reading. So it may come as a surprise to you if you haven't thought about this before, but many deaf children do find it very difficult to learn to read. And this is despite the fact that they have normal non-verbal IQ. So deafness is not a learning disability, yet the average deaf child leaves school age 16 with a reading age of around 10 or 11 years. And it's of course been well established that poor literacy not only affects education level, but also has lifelong consequences for vocational attainment and well-being. Okay, so why might this be then? So when we read a spoken language. So even though reading might appear to be a purely visual task, when we read, we're reading a spoken language written down on the page. That's what text is. It's a visual representation of spoken language. So for the hearing child learning to read, their challenge is or one of the challenges that they face is trying to crack this phonics code. So they have to learn the systematic mappings between not their knowledge of speech and speech sounds in particular, and then letters on the page. So for example, they have to make the link between the fact that the word cat can be broken down into the sounds, ka-a-ta, and that these map onto particular letters. Now, deaf children, of course, by definition, don't have full access to spoken language and to the structure of sounds, and so they struggle to learn to read. This is a good point to point out, a good place to point out that broader language skills are, of course, also important for learning to read, and sign language can help deaf children with that. But with the decoding aspect of learning to read, then some knowledge of the internal structure, what we call the phonology of the word, is needed. So how might deaf children, establish this? So we argue, on the basis of lots of past research, that deaf children can establish some knowledge about the fact that cat is broken down into ka-ata from lip reading, so from how it looks on the lips, and also to some extent from how it feels when you mouth or say the words cat. And so, although they may not be able to establish as rich representations as hearing people, as rich knowledge about the structure as hearing people, deaf children can establish some knowledge about the structure of words, the internal structure of words. And so on the basis of, I'm going to show you some data to support that statement in a minute, but on the basis of our past research, we have developed this model where we argue that deaf children are deriving information about the structure of speech from vision, how it looks on people's lips, and that this is contributing to their awareness of the internal structure of a word, so what we call phonological awareness, and then this is then supporting their reading just as it is in hearing people. And so here are some data to show you that deaf adults, in this case, can perform above chance levels when we ask them to make rhyme decisions about pictures. So here we had a large group of deaf adults and we asked them to decide whether the English labels for these types of pictures, such as chair and bear, rhyme. And there are a number of things to take away from this slide. One is that the deaf group are, of course, as we would expect, poorer than the hearing group. But there is great variability in this deaf group. So this whole bar here is representing the spread of scores in this group. So there are some that are doing extremely well. There are also some who are performing at chance, so they are not doing well at all. But as a group, they are performing significantly, so well above chance. And we've done a number of studies on this, as have others, and even when you've controlled for a number of variables, it seems that a number of deaf adults really can make these decisions about rhyme, and we are arguing that they are basing this information on how it looks on people's lips and how it feels when you mouth or say the word, so this motor component of speech, rather than, of course, on the sound. And importantly for our argument that we're trying to make, in this study, better rhymers were also better readers. And this has been shown in a number of studies with deaf people, although there is great variability. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but the main thing to take away from this is that in a number of our studies, what we wanted to do is look at those really good deaf adult readers. So deaf people do become excellent readers and go to university and come to UCL and do PhDs and so on. And so we want to know how they're doing it. And so we have looked at the brain networks, the areas of the brain, and the timing of processing in the brain when we ask these good readers to perform these rhyme judgment tasks. And the main thing to take away from this is that in these good readers and good rhymers in this case, similar areas of the brain are used with similar timing. Oh, gosh, sorry, that says for sign and speech. That should not say that. I apologize. But similar areas and similar timing is seen in both deaf and hearing people when they're making these judgments about speech. Okay, so that all got a bit complicated. So what does this actually mean? It means that even though these phonological representations of words, the internal structure of words, has to be initially based on different information for deaf and hearing people, that at some level in the brain where they are being analysed and contrasted, then we see very similar processing going on. And we argue that this lends support to this overall model that knowledge of the internal structure of spoken words can help reading as in deaf children, just as it does in hearing children. And we have other longer data over time to help to support that argument. Okay, so what we're doing now is testing this model in a trial. So we have lots of deaf children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds around the country at the moment, playing games that we have developed along with our collaborators at Cauldron. And we have developed these games. Half the children are playing lip reading games, half are playing maths games. We are predicting that those children that are being trained on lip reading over a 3-month period will have better understanding of the structure of words, and that this in time will help their reading. So we're in the middle of this trial at the moment. In the summer, we will know the outcome. But I thought I would show you and test you on some of your lip reading skills, just to keep you awake. So hopefully this will work. The important thing to point out, so your visual attention is in the right place to start with, is that you need to be focusing up where this question mark is. And you'll see a man say a word, and then you have to choose which of the pictures down at the bottom match what he is saying. Any ideas? So he didn't like that. So we're going to watch it again. Let's see if that likes that. He likes that. That's good. Okay. And so as the children get better at this, it gets more challenging for them. It adapts to their abilities. And then over time, we introduce letters. So here's an example of where we're introducing words. And so again, look where the question mark is to start. So here we're getting them to do the reverse. They have to see the word or the picture, and then they have to match to the speech. So we're trying in all directions to train their speech reading and mapping to letters. Okay, so hopefully in this very quick tour of what we're doing, hopefully I've shown you that language is more than just auditory speech, and we need to take a broader perspective if we want to think about language processing and how language is processed in the brain. And so I've also shown you that sign languages are not just really interesting, but they also are an important, or can be, a very useful scientific tool to help us find out unique information about how the brain processes language. And also I've shown you that some of our research in this field also has the potential to translate and perhaps have important implications for the classroom. So I'm just going to finish by tempting you to some after-lunch cake. So our department, the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre, is celebrating the 12 years of BSL recognition by having a BSL bake-off in the South Cloisters, very close to here. There is no obvious link between British Sign Language and baking, apart from if you've got good phonological awareness, they both begin with B. But apart from that, there is no link. But please come along, try some cake, find out more about sign language and about the courses that we are doing. And then I'd just like to finish by thanking all these people. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mairead. We have time for a few questions. I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. With the Plebgate scandal with Andrew Mitchell,
Yes.
outside 10 Downing Street, they have state-of-the-art CCTV, and yet there was this whole debate about whether he actually said, you pleb, etc., etc. Couldn't he have got a lip reader in to look at it? It sounds a dim question, but you kind of think there were millions of pounds spent and people lost their jobs, and I was at Jesus College, Cambridge with him as well. But you tell
Okay,
me...
I won't ask what you're okay.
In terms of lip reading, couldn't they...
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So there is a field called forensic lip reading, where absolutely there are expert lip readers who sell their time and go and collaborate on these things. And our collaborator that's named up here, Ruth Campbell, has become an expert in that field academically. She's not a lip reader herself. However, there are expert lip readers, but the issue is that you can never, ever be 100% sure. So a lot of what is going on when we lip read, when we speak, is behind the lips. So there is always going to be ambiguity. So there are some people who really, really are really good lip readers, but they will never be 100%. There would always be some ambiguity. So these forensic lip readers operate in courtrooms, as do clinical experts. So they give their opinion, but nobody can ever say it's 100% right until you get the audio track.
But if I said to you, it has 3 consonants and 1 vowel, that's pretty easy, isn't it?
But there are things, but b, if you just had the b, it is confusable easily. So if I do b without the voice, it's very confusable with m without the voice. They look exactly the same on the lips. So it all depends. There's always going to be that confusability, and context will help with that and various things, but there will always be some ambiguity.
Thank you very much for an interesting lecture. I was wondering if you'd found any gender differentiation in developmental learning and language acquisition. I was also wondering if there's, like with speech, if we learn a second language as a critical age at which it becomes, after say 11 or 12, it becomes harder to learn. Would that be the same for BSL learning ASL? Is there a critical point at which it becomes much harder? And I was wondering if there are any insights about language processing and, say, Asperger's, neurological conditions that might highlight any, how someone with Asperger's learning sign language, how they might interpret language, and if that's different from people who don't have Asperger's. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so three questions. Test my memory here to see if I can remember them all. So gender, no, that hasn't been looked at in terms of the neural systems supporting language processing in people who are deaf. So it's very difficult and expensive to do these studies. So we haven't got the sizes to look at gender issues there. So nobody's looked at that in this field. Development and critical periods. Yes, if you were a native user of British Sign Language and you moved and you wanted to learn ASL, then you would be learning it just as, and you said the age 11 or something, that would be just like you learning French at age 11, having a first language of spoken language. So that's where we're talking about a native signer learning another native language. It would just be the same as a bilingual hearing person learning spoken languages. But there are more interesting questions to ask about sensitive language periods with deaf children, because as I pointed out, only 5 to 10% of deaf children are actually exposed to sign language very early in life with their deaf parents. So that means we've got about 90 to 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who probably don't know sign language. And so there's lots of complexities there about choices and the languages that they're exposed to and so on, where we can ask very interesting questions about age of language exposure. The third question, I'm doing well, is about Asperger's. I'm doing very well, I'm impressed. Asperger's. So There is some research looking at autism in deaf children, but Asperger's specifically, I'm not sure about any research in that field. They were included in the larger ASD spectrum. So if you're interested in that area, if you look at research by Tanya Denmark, then you could find out more about that. Okay.
You were next, and then you.
Well, as he asked more than one. Firstly, I want to ask about if someone has an operation and they get their hearing for the first time after critical development, and also if they're hearing at birth and then they lose their hearing, what effect does that have? Then I'd like to ask about people who are deaf and dumb, like Helen Keller.
Deaf and blind.
Deaf and blind, sorry, I apologise. And also, I was still thinking about his question up there. and second, can you not film me? And secondly, did Chomsky do anything about the question of deafness?
Okay, again, well, you're really wanting to test my memory here. Right, then I got distracted by the self-speak question. Okay, remind me of the very first question, sorry.
And that was about people who have who are deaf and then they have an operation.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'll just answer two questions so that other people can have a go. Okay, so when you say...
perhaps more important, countries where women have to keep their face covered, you said it's very important how the visual aspect, but that must be a great detriment to them. That's almost as important as any other question. Thank you.
Okay. I think visual speech, visual communication is extremely important. So how that works in those countries, I'm not sure. Or how that's viewed in those countries, I'm not sure. Cochlear implants is an important question. So you said what happens when somebody has an operation and their hearing is restored. So that's a very simplistic way to put it, and often it's the way that people think about it. But actually, cochlear implants are best thought of really as fancy hearing aids. And so for some people, they do work very well, and they can offer really good access to the auditory component of spoken language. But for other people who have them, they don't work very well at all. And the challenge there is to determine who is it going to work for and who's not, and how best to help the child or the adult get the most from that cochlear implant. But there's a lot of evidence showing that even for those with cochlear implants, that visual speech is very important. So good speech readers, people who are good in adults, people who are good lip readers before they have the cochlear implant often tend to have really good outcomes with the cochlear implant later. Okay, maybe I can talk to you about your other questions later.
You were next.
Hi, it's just one question.
Thank you.
So basically, it seems to me that what you have found is that the brain, one area of the brain is specific in the way that it processes how it decides to communicate. However, it would then use other parts of the brain, so the visual part or the space part, to sort of use the body to then communicate that language bit. So it seems to me that there is a core area that wants to communicate, but then it decides to do that in different ways. Is there any research to sort of look at how the brain can communicate in a way that's more accessible for everyone? So it seems to me that language has been developed and dominated by hearing people, and right now we're trying to find ways of how deaf people or deaf children can learn to use our way of communicating. However, they have the same core processing area in the brain, so maybe trying to develop a different way of communicating rather than basing how people, how hearing people communicate as like the main way of doing it, and then how everyone else can sort of more adapt towards that. Do you know what I mean? So is there any research trying to think of it more, rather than scientifically, but more socially, of how language and communication can develop away from this idea of only the way that hearing people, it has been developed by the way hearing people have developed it, if you see what I mean?
I think I do. So two quick things to point out. One is that your summary of the data of what I showed you in that first part, just to clarify that, all of these studies were people watching sign language. So there's no decisions. There's nothing about production. There's nothing about the person lying in the scanner while we're scanning their brain deciding how then to communicate with another person. They're watching the language, and then they're processing it and doing whatever we're asking them to do with it. And then we see these core regions that are involved in both, and then these other regions that may only be involved in the two different languages. And then your second point, I think that we are doing, so signed languages are used by a large sign language community in this country, and then the other sign languages are used by communities in the other countries, American Sign Language, Israeli Sign Language, whatever it might be. So to address your point, what we would want to do is to encourage more hearing people to learn sign language and to be able to say, good morning, thank you, yes please, to signers in their community. So I think that would address your broader social concerns to some extent.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
I think you were.
Hi, thanks very much for a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have also only one question, and I've heard, and I don't know whether this is true, that often in deaf schools nowadays, instead of teaching BSL, it's actually mainly through lip reading that is taught. And I was wondering whether this has to do with the evidence that you presented that actually has to do with reading and how it improves reading, the lip reading skills.
Okay. So there's great variability amongst education practices in deaf children. So there are some deaf schools that use a bilingual approach, so they will use BSL alongside. They will use BSL in some situations and then English, written English in other situations. There are some schools and some educational settings that are purely oral, so the children don't use sign language at all. So there is great variability. I think it would be wrong to say that there's a push towards speech reading. I think there is still a balance, and if anything, there's a push towards interest in bilingualism in the school settings. But the other part of that is that more and more children are having cochlear implants, and more children are being out in mainstream settings, in schools with some support on their own. So they're in a hearing school but with some support. So those children more often are more reliant on visual speech and on lip reading and the oral communication. How does that relate to my research? I think that gives me a really good opportunity to say that I view this research focusing on lip reading and the importance to reading as being just one part of that reading step, and it's that very early step into reading of decoding, breaking down words and single word reading. But children have to have a broader language base upon which that sits and to really develop their literacy skills. And I think that spoken language, a rich spoken language or a rich sign language that they can fully access will give them that.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we can't take any more questions because the next group is coming in. Can you join me in thanking Mairead again for a great talk?